Everyone, I'm Christine Zellers, and joining me today is Fong Pommier, who is the consultant for Family and Community Health Sciences, and I am the educator slash assistant professor for Family and Community Health Sciences in Cape May County from Rutgers Cooperative Extension. Fong, you good? You can see my screen? All right, perfect. So before we get started in the presentation, I just wanted to quickly review the cooperative extension structure for you at Rutgers Cooperative Extension for those who aren't familiar with it. We're a partnership between the Board of County Commissioners, Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. We have faculty in 20 of the 21 New Jersey counties, and we're composed, excuse me, of 3 different departments, which is Agriculture and Natural Resources, 4-H Youth Development, and then FCHS, which stands for Family and Community Health Sciences, which is the department that I am with. And in FCHS, we provide outreach in New Jersey and beyond on topics related to nutrition, chronic disease prevention, food safety, and overall wellness. We really hope that you'll visit our websites, which I will provide a list of how to contact me at the end, and one of them includes the websites for both Rutgers Cooperative Extension's FCHS program on a statewide level and the local Cape May County level. And then it also will include our social media handles. Today's presentation is going to be recorded, and it's part of our Lunch and Learn series, which we have every month on the last Thursday of the month. We do begin at 12:15, even though it says 12 o'clock on the Zoom. Zoom does not allow me to put 12:15. They're very picky about those top of the hours and half hours. So it says 12 o'clock, but we start at 12:15. So I thank you all for joining us today, and we're going to get started. Today's topic is dietary fats, the good and the bad. We're going to have 3 objectives today for the conversation, which we're going to understand the need for dietary fat. We're going to recognize the differences in dietary fat, and then we're going to discover ways to lower unhealthy fat consumption and get needed healthy fats into our diets. So back in the 1960s, give you a little history background on this. Back in the 1960s to 1970s, there were 8 US senators that died prematurely while they were in office. So of course, people stood up and took notice to this. If we have 8 of them all dying in that, decade span, there could possibly be a problem. And tobacco products were being recognized as a danger to health. And this kind of spawned the idea that maybe diet and heart disease could have a link as well to heart disease. So they started looking at this particularly because a lot of these US senators would go for lunch at places around the area they worked in, and they noticed that they had really high fat diets at these local places. So immediately the assumption was that fats and heart health were correlated, and that a lower fat diet was needed to reduce the incidence of heart disease. But what happened when this lower fat came into play, so people started eating a fat-free diet or a low-fat diet, products started to contain a lot more sugar. So the sugar content came up. And they had to do that because when they took the fat out of products, they realized they didn't taste so good. So everybody's like, oh, fat-free doesn't taste good. Some of you might remember that, like me. And so they added sugar to products. And this really started to create a problem with the sugar content. So while the removal of fat and the increase in sugar caused us to eventually learn that fat-free wasn't totally needed in our diet. So the fat-free notion was a really good idea. Like, it was a good concept to try to find the determinant that was causing people to have heart issues, but it wasn't fully hatched. The original heart diet premise was that fat caused high cholesterol, and therefore it should be removed from the diet to create a heart-healthy diet. While saturated fat could be a casual determinant of high cholesterol, it's not the only contributor. So it's important to realize that blood lipids and lipoproteins, hypertension, smoking, diabetes, overweight, and obesity are also factors that contribute to heart-related diseases. So in reality, no one factor is responsible for cardiovascular disease that can be determined at this point. And blaming one thing like fat, it's not really realistic. We need to look at the other factors that could be contributing. Here in we're now in 2021, we're about 50 years later, 50 something years later, and we're still not really that healthy. We're still having chronic heart disease and, still a leading cause of premature death. So we've learned things that we need to do. We've learned that fats are needed in our diet, and healthy fats are needed in our body. But the answer to taking them out didn't relieve it and make us healthier overall. The best course of action is always, as many of you have heard in my other discussions, is including a healthy lifestyle overall and a balanced diet with movement. So keep that in mind as we move on. But I thought it was important to give you that background so that you understood why did we all of a sudden decide to take fat out of our lifestyle? And it really was because, they were trying to attribute it to an unhealthy heart health. So let's talk about a little bit about Americans and what we continue to do. So unfortunately, Americans continue to think, because of the belief back in the 80s and 90s that fat was the bad guy, that we still think that fat overall is a bad component. 41% of the population thinks that fat is still bad in our diet. And that's according to a study that was published in the National Library of Medicine. Fat, however, is an essential nutrient, and our bodies do need it. Fat promotes cell growth, and it provides us with energy to function. It helps us to produce hormones as well. Not all fats the same, so not all fats created equal. So for instance, good fats come from lean meats, from nuts and seeds, avocados, and vegetable oils. And these fats are beneficial to our bodies. They're nutrient dense. So we get the benefit for our bodies for doing, all the things we need there. And they're also nutrient dense, so they're healthy for us. Good fats have two categories that fall under unsaturated fats. They're called polyunsaturated fats and monounsaturated fats. And we'll talk about that a little bit in greater detail about these good fats. But in the meantime, we can also recognize, and we'll talk about these later too, saturated fat. It's not totally bad for us, but we need to use it minimally to avoid chronic disease. So we'll talk a little bit greater about saturated fat, which is the second type of fat. And then the third type of fat that we're going to talk about is trans fat. And trans fat we really want to try to avoid, especially the processed kind. The important thing to remember as was I muted?
You just did, and now I can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay. Sorry about that. So I don't know where I went to mute with, but I'm going to talk about all the different types of fat, the three different types of fat, the mono and polyunsaturated fat, which fall under the unsaturated fat category, trans fats, which we know are not good for us, and then saturated fats, which we need to have in our diet minimally. A perfect example of these three different types of fats and the concept that people think we need to avoid fats is that I had somebody I was talking to one time, and I suggested they eat avocados, and their reaction was, oh, I don't want to eat avocados. They have fat in them. Well, avocados are the good fat. So remember in that terms. And the same person in the next sentence was telling me about how much they love cupcakes. So cupcakes are one of the fats that we want to, be moderate with. So they're not so much the healthy fat. So avocados, healthy fat, cupcakes, not so much. So let's look at this a little bit closer. Oh, now I can't get the screen to go. There we go. All right, so let's look at the three types of fats as a preview, and then we'll get it a little bit more in detail. Saturated fats, which you can see over there on the left, are fats from animals like butter and meats. Lower saturated fats, which still fall in the saturated category, are chicken and pork. It's recommended that we eat less saturated fats to reduce the risk of heart disease and to improve good cholesterol. Trans fats, which are over on the other side of the screen, are made from vegetable oil, but are processed by way of hydrogenation. So trans fats are used in processed cakes and foods. Like saturated fats, they should be limited. And in fact, trans fats have been recommended to be removed from foods due to their suspected detriment. And we'll get a little bit into that a little bit more. So you can see so far, trans fats are don't want those. Saturated fat a little bit. We want to try to, have lean meats and things like that as our saturated fats. And then in the center column there, you can see we have unsaturated fats. So you can see less of the saturated fat, less of the trans fat, and then happy face for the unsaturated fats. They're the ones that we are good with. So unsaturated fats come from olives, from nuts and seeds, and as well as fish. And there are two types, the monounsaturated and the polyunsaturated fats. These good fats support good cell health, they store nutrients, and they produce important hormones. As a side note, the dietary guideline recommends keeping saturated fats, that they're the ones we say minimal. They want to keep that to less than 10% of our calories per day. The recommendation is based on scientific evidence that replacing saturated fats with unsaturated fats is associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. Note that specifically, there's no specific amount given. As we have a specific amount of fruits and vegetables we want to eat each day, but there is not a specific recommendation for saturated fats, because the healthy outcomes has not been discovered in research. So the dietary guidelines recommends limiting saturated fats and using unsaturated fats instead. And before we got in the call, Fong and I were talking about how much we love doing this research. And, we find things like this, and they, again, like the recommendations changed. And the reason the recommendations change is because the research comes out that says, hey, it's not just fat making our heart unhealthy. And so they look at things in greater detail. So we're fortunate to have that research become available, but unfortunately it does take some time and a lot of work and effort in the researching area. It's also important to note, as we're talking about this, that all fats have 9 calories in each gram. So in each gram of fat, there's 9 calories. In comparison, carbohydrates and proteins each have 4 calories per gram. So this is really a good reason to make sure to limit the saturated fats and try to focus on eating healthy, unsaturated fats. And that's going to help you to maintain a healthy weight. So think of it in those terms too, that 9 calorie versus the 4 calorie. All right, let's dive a little bit deeper. So now that we have a general idea of these types of dietary fats and healthy fats that are needed, let's look closer at saturated fats. You'll remember from the last slide, saturated fats are ones that we want to eat less of. And a good way to remember this is the recommendation for protein, right? They say eat lean. When we look at my plate, they say to eat lean meats. So meats have saturated fats in them, and eating lean protein or animal fat will help reduce the intake of saturated fats. Any person that's over the age of 2 years old, the recommendation for saturated fats, as I said in the last slide, is 10% of calories consumed per day. So try to replace saturated fats with unsaturated fats, especially polyunsaturated fats. And examples of polyunsaturated fats that we'll discuss a little bit later in the presentation, so you'll know which ones to use to substitute. Be cautious about eating saturated fats like butter, and adding too much of that. If you add a lot of butter, say, to your sweet potato, then that's going to increase your intake of saturated fats to more than maybe what's recommended. So you want to keep those saturated fats like butter that are not lean to a minimum. Some foods contain saturated fats. So for instance, fatty meats, keep those to a minimum as well. And instead of high fat meats, choose plant-based protein or lean meat like chicken and fish more often than the high fat meats. Please realize that even lean foods can have saturated fats in them, like nuts, eggs, and lean meat. Grains and saturated fats, grains and saturated fatty acids in oils. So even though they're leaner, they still will have saturated fats in them. Lean and nutrient-dense sources of saturated fat account for about 5% of all calories in Americans' diets. So that leaves space for saturated fat, because remember, we want to stay, it's little space for saturated fat. We want to stay at 10%. So to give an example of that, excuse me, eggs have 3 grams of unsaturated fat and 2 grams of saturated fat. So you can see, like, you're eating a lean thing, you're eating an egg that is considered to be a lean fat, or because it has the 3 grams of unsaturated fat, but at the same time, it still has 2 grams of saturated fat. So you can see how they overlap and they can build that 10% really easily. So you want to be cautious with how much you eat of the highly saturated fats like butter. So let's see. We'll take a little chat time now to make sure everybody's getting what I'm saying. Let's see if you know what the highest source of saturated fats are in the American diet. Type it in the chat. What is your guess that's the highest source of saturated highest source of saturated fats in the American diet? Let's see. Let's put that in the chat and we'll see what you think about that. Let's see. I have to get the chat here. I can't see the chat for some reason. I wonder why it's not letting me see the chat today. Let me see if I move. Can you see the chat? Yeah.
Yeah, I can.
I know where I'm not getting it. Let me stop sharing. Oh, there it goes. Now I have it. Processed meat, somebody said. Red meat. They're good guesses. Anybody else have idea what the highest amount of processed, I'm sorry, I read processed. The highest amount of saturated fat in the American's diet. Anybody have any other guesses on that besides processed meat and red meat? Hydrogenated oils. So hydrogenated oils are trans fats, and we're going to get to that in a minute, but that's a really good guess. And thanks for bringing that up. Anybody else? All right, I'm going to go back to my share screen. So for those of you that guessed the processed meat, you were correct. So 19% of the American diets that include saturated fat comes from sandwiches. So that could be the processed meat. So that includes burgers, tacos, and burritos. And then in second place, we have desserts and sweets, which nobody guessed. That's 11% of American saturated fat consumption. And then rice, pasta, and other grain-based mixed dishes come out to 7%. And I'm sure that's because we're putting butter and high-fat cheese on those. And then higher fat milk and yogurt are 6%. And pizza is 5% of Americans' consumption of saturated fats on a daily basis. So based on that, remember that the recommendation is to eat low-fat or fat-free dairy products because that's probably included in some of those things that we eat a lot of saturated fat in. The low-fat versions of dairy products have the same amount of calcium and nutrients in them, but they're not, they don't have the saturated fat that their counterparts do. So that's why it's important to eat those. I'd also like to mention that butter and coconut oil, palm kernel oil, and palm oil all have higher amounts of saturated fat. So be mindful of that when you're looking at ingredient contents, because not all plant-based oils are the same. Okay, so now that we've covered all of this, the recommendations are that we have 10% of our daily calories are saturated fats. So you want to remember that. To do that, some hints to helping to do that: eat smaller portion sizes of sweets or eat less sweets. Opt for like maybe a smaller cookie or a smaller piece of cake if you're going to indulge in that to keep your saturated fats down. Check the nutrition label and look for foods that are lower, have lower amounts of saturated fat before you indulge in those. Try using low fat or fat-free dairy products such as yogurt, and milk, since like I mentioned, and even cheese. You can eat low fat and fat-free to have lower saturated fats. Try using dairy-free products. Oh, I said that, sorry. Try using nuts and seeds or avocados as a replacement for higher saturated foods. And then if you want more, I have down at the bottom of the screen there, you'll see the My Plate app, or link. You can go there and I'll send that to you after the slide presentation, but you can go there and they have a lot more of the saturated fat list for your references. So you know which ones are good to eat, but those are just a couple off the top. So somebody mentioned hydrogenated oil in processed oil in the in the slide in the chat when I asked about those type of oils that or those type of things that are high in the diet for saturated fat. So hydrogen, partially hydrogenated vegetable oil is a trans fat, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So the trans fat. So 2 slides ago, I talked about trans fat as a very limited consumption fat, and they've actually been banned in the United States and many other countries. Trans fats have. You can see here that the product, I have to change something around here. I have to move my little screen thing. You can see here that the trans fat listed in this nutrition facts label, there is a place for it down at the bottom under total fats, and it says 0. So that's really a great thing to know. However, we can find that trans fats are hidden even though they've been banned and taken out. So I wanted to point that out to you because it's really important that you look at the nutrition facts label to see if there's trans fat, because usually it's going to come up as 0. But if a product has 0.5 grams of trans fat in it, then it could be hidden and say 0. If it's 0.5 or less, it can say 0 in there. So let's talk about how that can kind of get us. The process for making trans fats is hydrogen is added to vegetable oil to form a semi-solid product known as partially hydrogenated oil. So if you look down on the ingredients label here, you can see where it's highlighted. It has 0 trans fat, and then it has partially hydrogenated vegetable oil and hydrogenated oils in there. So again, this product probably has 0.5 or lower in it, but it actually does have it in there. So they don't have to show it on the nutrition facts label if it's 0.5 or below. So despite the ban, there's still a chance you could be consuming it. And one way to get trans fats is from natural trans fats. So there's natural and there's the processed kind. So the natural comes from things like they're formed in the bacteria of the stomach of cattle, sheep, and goats. And trans fats of these natural kind make up about 3 to 7% of the total fat in dairy products. So they could be in milk and cheese, and then they could be in beef and lamb and pork and chicken. But that's the natural kind. In the studies that I looked into, that natural trans fat has not been shown to be harmful the way that the processed kind has. The processed kind, like I said, could be on the label. And why that could be bad for us, if you look, say, I'm going to look at the nutrition food facts label, I'm being good. Oh, there's 0% trans fat in this product. However, again, if it's below that 0.5 and it doesn't show up, you could be eating, say, microwave popcorn has it in it sometimes. So you could be eating a full bag of microwave popcorn, which is 4 servings, and getting 2 grams of trans fat because you're not reading the ingredients label that says that it has it in there. So what I would suggest to make sure you're not getting trans fat is to make sure you look at that ingredients food label and make sure that it doesn't say the words partially, I'm going to put it up there, partially hydrogenated oil on there, because you want to make sure that it does not have partially hydrogenated vegetable oil in it, because that's trans fat. So they're found lots of times. The trans fat are commonly found in fast fried food, microwave popcorn, as I said. It's in some margarines and certain oils. It's in bakery products like donuts, muffins, cakes, and pastries. And it can also be found in creamers. And I do put creamer in my coffee, so I jumped up right away to make sure I didn't have trans fat in there. I looked at the nutrition facts label. I looked at the ingredients label. It wasn't in the kind of creamer that I use. But you should be on the lookout for it. And if you eat natural creamers or creamers made with a milk base, then it shouldn't be in there, but you want to check that out. It can also be hidden in things like frosting or icing that we put on cakes that are in a canister, potato chips and pizza. So check it out and make sure that they're not in there. They might have it. And the other thing about trans fat that's not good, products that are labeled with no trans fat might actually be high in saturated fat. So they tend to have a lot of sugar, and they might be labeled no trans fat and then be high in saturated fat. So check out the labels for those and make those type of things that are processed and make sure that they're not trans fat. Remember, the trans fats that are processed, that go through that hydrogenation process, are the ones that are bad for us. All right, so now we talked about the saturated fat, keeping them to a minimum. And then we went to the trans fat, don't want those. And now we're going to talk about the unsaturated fats. And these are the good kind. They're the ones that got the smiley face on the first sheet. So monosaturated fats monosaturated fats and polysaturated fats can lower bad cholesterol, and that's why they're good for us. They support a healthy eating pattern along with fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and they're beneficial to a healthy lifestyle. Monounsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature and start to get solid when they're chilled. So examples of this would be olive oil, for instance. Other monounsaturated fats include peanut oil, sapphire oil, sesame oil, avocados, and nut butters. So there's two types. There's unsaturated fats, monounsaturated fat that you can see on the right, and then the polyunsaturated fat. Polyunsaturated fats reduce the risk of heart disease and stroke and maintain the body cells. It also produces omega-6 and 3s. Both should be eaten in moderation, and you should choose more of these types of fats, the monounsaturated fats, and less of the saturated fats and trans fats. They have positive effects on the health, and that's the reason we want to eat more of these. Just to have a side note, I mentioned before about the vegetable oils and the type of oils that are good for us. So coconut oil is mostly saturated fat, and that's why it's not on here. I figured I might get the question of why these oils weren't on there. So coconut oil is 85% saturated fat. Palm oil is 50% saturated fat, and then palm kernel oils are also more than 85% saturated fat. So that's why they're not on the list. Vegetable oils are considered unsaturated fats. And I actually went and checked the one I have in my house, and that's made from soybean oil. It has a small amount of saturated fat in it, but the bulk of it is made from unsaturated fat, poly and monounsaturated fats. The other note that I wanted to make about some of these unsaturated fat oils especially is that they tend to, some of them, especially if it's like a lighter olive oil, if you heat it to a higher temperature, it might start to smoke. So generally speaking, olive oils, usually around 300 to 350 degrees, they're able to withstand. But then if you want a vegetable oil that can cook at a higher temperature, you want to look at a vegetable oil, a sapphire oil, or a canola oil, because they can withstand up to usually about 450 degrees. So just as a sidebar with the oils and cooking, I thought that might come up as a question. So just to summarize all of this, for being mindful of what type of fat you're consuming, you want to remember that good fats are unsaturated fats like the poly and monounsaturated fats. They're healthier and they'll decrease the bad cholesterol and increase good cholesterol. They also prevent heart disease and stroke. Unsaturated fats help to maintain the body's cells, and they dissolve vitamins in the body like A, C, E, and K, and that we get from food. So that's why they're good for us. And they are an essential nutrient. Bad guys of fat are those processed trans fats. We want to avoid them, and we want to because they increase the risk of heart disease as well as stroke and type 2 diabetes. So trans fats, don't want them. They also lower good and raise bad cholesterol. And processed trans fats are called partially hydrogenated oils, and you want to avoid those. Look at the ingredients label to make sure you're avoiding them on your food. For moderate fats, we want to look at saturated fats and consume those. If you eat too much, it could increase bad cholesterol and may cause heart disease. So that's why we want to keep it at that 10% of our daily calories or lower. To do this, you have to eat lean choices of meat and less fat, no skin. Don't eat the skin because they contain a lot of saturated fat on products like chicken. Also want to include grains and fruits and vegetables to keep a nutrient-dense eating pattern with those. And then I wanted to include, as I mentioned in the beginning under the objectives, I wanted to include some tricks to remove unhealthy fats like trans fats and limit saturated fats. So to do that, try to avoid fats that come from packaged or processed foods. Many times baked goods are high in saturated fat or contain trans fats, so avoid using them in large amounts. Read the ingredients label and look at the nutrition facts label to see if you're getting saturated or unsaturated fats. Try using healthy fats that are plant-based for cooking, for oils to cook, and make sure they're not the higher saturated ones. Use healthy oils like olive, canola, soybean, or sesame as the base for homemade salad dressings. So that's if you make your own salad dressings or want to start doing that to reduce the amount of fat, saturated fat in your diet, you can use those unsaturated fats to do that. Fish is a great way to eat low calorie, low fat, nutrient dense protein. So try replacing those higher saturated fat products with fish a few times per week, because that'll help bring your saturated fat count down. Choose plant-based proteins like beans and legumes for some of your meals, because that'll help reduce that saturated fat and get you some good protein. Bake with saffron oil, or try using applesauce to replace oils. And also choose lean meats and use real milk or creamer that's fat-free or low fat in your coffee or tea. Choose low fat or fat-free dairy products like milk, cheeses, and yogurt. Saute your vegetables with olive oil rather than butter or shortening. And have nuts, seeds, or olives for snack instead of chips. And then try using low sodium chicken broth instead of butter in gravies and sauces. So one particular time that I do this is when I make chicken marsala. Instead of using butter, which is what the recipe called for, I use the low sodium chicken broth. So you can substitute that in other recipes too. That's just an example of how I like to use it. But think about ways to sub that butter out and put create less saturated fat in your dishes. You can make little changes over time that create a healthier living lifestyle for yourself and your family by doing these things.
Hey, Chris.
Go ahead.
I want to let you know that it's 12:47.
Yes, thank you. I'm almost at the end. So if you want to go ahead and release the poll now, if you would all take a minute to take the poll, I appreciate that. And I'm sorry all this time has been spent on fat talk, but I'm going to conclude it and wrap it up here if you all have a second to do that. This is, if you want to scan this barcode or the QRL, this is a link to an evaluation, and that's very important to me, as is the poll. Having the poll and the evaluation gives me the feedback that I need to know how I'm presenting and what you're interested in learning. So if you could do that, I'd very much appreciate it. So the poll has been released. If you could go ahead and do that. And then I'm going, and then to conclude everything, just to wrap everything up, make sure to use unsaturated fats more for better health, and be aware of saturated fats and use those in moderation. You want to combine unsaturated and saturated fats with a healthy eating pattern that includes lean meats, plant protein, fruit, veggies, and whole grains. And of course, you want to be physically active every day. Avoid processed food and eat whole foods to avoid trans fats. Cook with unsaturated oils. And remember, good health isn't removing things like fat, but rather knowing which fats to eat and remembering that we all need good, healthy fats for a healthy body. I thank you all for coming today. This is my resources. And then these are my contacts that I promised I would provide for you. Coming up in March, we have sodium. We'll be feeling a little salty. Will be our sodium lesson for the Lunch and Learn next month. And then we'll also have Eat What You Grow series will be picked up again. I know a lot of you joined us last year for those. We'll have new topics in the Eat What You Grow series, and there'll be several of those throughout the growing season. You're welcome to join us for. Physical activity, we'll have a physical activity interactive webinar that'll be done by myself and a few of the colleagues that I have across the state, that you will be able to tune in and ask questions. It won't be a presentation format. It'll be like an interactive panel type discussion. We'll also have Ocean City Library is going to host me for a Food Label 411. And then we will have 2 Lunch and Learns. One I will be a part of and one I will be hosting this month, the month of March, that will be on seafood and healthy living. So I hope you all enjoyed, and I'm going to stop sharing so I can look and see if there's any questions I can answer really quickly. Let's see. Thank you for the 1244. I couldn't see that. Yeah, if you have any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat as you answer the polls. And I hope you all stay very healthy and enjoy this beautiful sunshine that we're finally getting. Yay. Thanks for joining us.